We continue now at the top of Daf Lamed Beis Amud Beis in Meseches Rosh Hashana. This is Rosh Hashana Daf 32b. And the previous Amud, the Mishnah said that in Malchios, Zichronos, and Shofros, we don't mention psukim of punishment. And so the Gemara says, Malchios, what's an example in Malchios of a pasuk of punishment? Kagon, for example, the pasuk says, Chayoninu Mashem Elokim, Im lo bi'ar chazako v'zor natuyo v'chema shvucha emloch aleichem. It talks about HaKadosh Baruch Hu being king in anger. V'afagav damer of Nachman, the Gemara says, even though Rav Nachman said, Kol ki ha'irischol lirsach kutchabrichu, this kind of anger, let HaKadosh Baruch Hu be angry alone against us, v'lifrokinan, if that means that we're going to be redeemed. So it seems like a positive pasuk is talking about redemption, but still, kevan de v'rischa amor, since the pasuk was said in anger, atchure rischa b'reishasa lo charinan. We don't mention anger on Rosh Hashanah. Zichron Kagon, what's an example of a pasuk that has to do with punishment by Zichronos? For example, the pasuk says, there's a pasuk in Tehillim, Vayizkar ki basar hema v'gomer, talks about the fact that people are just flesh, like the wind that passes. Shofar Kagon, what's an example by Shofaros, a pasuk that has to do with punishment? This is a pasuk in Hosea. Pasuk says, Tiku shofar begiva v'gomer, talks about blowing the shofar and giva. Avalim ba lomar malchus zichron v'shofar shel poranus shalov de kochavim. But let's say a person wants to say psukim of Malchios, Zichronos, and Shofros that have to do with punishment of the idol worshippers. Omer, that he can say that's allowed in the brachas. And examples of that, Malchus Kagon, Malchus, an example would be Hashem Molech Yirgazu Amim, anger against the nations. Or Kagon Hashem Melech Olam Vad Avdu Goyim Me'artz, so talks about destroying the nations. Zichron Kagon, a remembrance pasuk that has to do with punishment of the idol worshippers. For example, Zechor Hashem Levnei Edom, talks about punishment against the Bnei Edom. Shofar Kagon V'Hashem Elokim V'Shofar Yiska V'Holach B'Saros Teimon. Also they're talking about the Saros Teimon, anger against the nations. Uchsiv, and the pasuk also says, Hashem Tzavakos Yogen Aleim. The pasuk says that Hashem is going to defend against them. Ein Maskirin Zicharon Shal Yachid. The Gemara says we don't mention Zichronos if it has to do just with an individual. It has to be something that has to do with the public. Even if it's a Zikaron that is good, it's a beneficial thing, but if it has to do only with an individual, so then we don't mention that in the psukim, in the bracha. Kagon, for example, Zachreini Hashem B'Ritzon Amecha, said in the singular, again has to do just with an individual, we don't say that. Or Kagon, another example, Zachra Li Elokai Latova, again has to do with an individual, says Li in the singular. Pikdonos harein kizichronos, and the Gemara says pikdonos, if you have a pasuk that uses the word pakad, that's the same thing as a pasuk that uses the word to zachar, to remember. And the Gemara gives examples. Kagon, for example, Hashem pakad as Sarah, it says that Hashem remembered Sarah, that would count. Ukagon pakod pakadati eschem, I surely will remember you. Divrei Rabbi Yossi, this is the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. Again, this is the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi is saying that you have the word the pakad, that's going to count as zikaron. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda disagrees and says einon kizichronos. Einon kizichronos. He uses the word pakad, so then that doesn't count as zichronos. But the Gemara says still, Rabbi Yossi, according to Rabbi Yossi, Nehi nami de pikdonos harein kizichronos. Even if you're going to tell me that pikdonos counts as zichronos, Hashem pakad esara pikadon diyachiru, but isn't Hashem pakad esara, isn't that only remembering an individual? We said that we're not allowed to have psukim that only talk about the individual. It has to be the public. And so to that, the Gemara answers, Kevan da'asu ravim mina, since the public came from her, Sarah is the mother of Klal Yisrael, so therefore karabim damya, that's considered like it refers to the public. The Gemara continues, Su sharim rashechem v'inasu pischeolam v'yavo melech hakavod, miza melech hakavod, Hashem izus v'gibor, Hashem gibor melchama, Su sharim rashechem v'su pischeolam v'yavo melech hakavod, miuza melech hakavod, Hashem tzavakos u'melech hakavod sela. So it mentions the word melech many times in these psukim. So how many total does this count for? So the Gemara says Rishona Shtayim and Shania Shalosh. The first part that has 2 times it says the word melech, and in the second part of that, in the second half of those psukim, it says it 3 times. It's a total of 5. Divrei Rabbi Yossi, that's Rabbi Yossi's opinion. If you look over here, so it says again, it says V'yavo melech hakavod, that's number 1. Mizeh melech hakavod, that's number 2. And then the pasuk goes on and says, V'yavo melech hakavod, that's number 3. Mihuzeh melech hakavod, that's number 4. Hashem tzavakos hu melech hakavod sela, that's number 5. It's a total of 5 according to Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yehuda says, Rishon achas shniya shtayim. No, in the first half you can only count 1 of them. In the second you only count 2. The idea is, when the pasuk is asking who is the melech hakavod, you can't count those. And that happens twice, so you have to subtract 2. So you have 5 minus 2, you really only have a total of 3. Another similar machlokas over here, Zamru Elokim Zameru, Zamru L'malkeinu Zameru, Ki melech kol haaretz Elokim. How much does that count over here? It mentions Zamru L'malkeinu Zameru, and it says melech kol haaretz, says 2. So Shtayim, Divrei Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says this mentions melech 2 times, so therefore it counts as 2. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees on this one as well, and he says achas, it only counts as one. And Rashi over here explains Zamru lemalkeinu loka chashiv Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't count our king, because that's only our king. It's only on one nation. It has to be a pasuk that mentions the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is melech over the entire world. And the Gemara continues, V'shavin, but both Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda, they both agree, B'melech Elokim al Goyim Elokim Yoshav al Kisei Kodsho Shiyachas. When it talks about al Goyim and al Kisei Kodsho, it only counts as one. It only counts when it says Melech. The fact that he's sitting on the throne is not considered a mention of Malchus. And then the Gemara continues, Zicharon Sheyesh Bo Trua. What would be a situation, let's say you have where it mentions Zikaron, so it mentions Zichronos, and it mentions Trua, which seems to be a reference to shofar. So Kagon, for example, Shabbos and Zichron Trua Mikra Kodesh. It says in the pasuk Zichron Trua. So Omra im ha-Zichronos v'Omra im ha-Shofros. You can use that pasuk for Zichronos and for shofars, because the word Trua would count as shofaros. Divrei Rabbi Yossi, that's the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, Eino Omra elim ha-Zichronos bilvad. You can only count it with Zichronos. You can't count it with shofaros, because it doesn't say shofar. It just says Trua. Similarly, Malchus Sheyesh Imo Trua. Let's say you have a situation where it says Malchus and it says Trua. Kagon Hashem Elokav Imo Usruas Melech Bo talks about Truas Melech. So Omrim HaMalchius v'Omrim HaShofaris. So you could say with Malchius and Shofaris. Again, same idea. It says Melech and it says Trua. Trua counts as Shofar. Divrei Rabbi Yossi. That's Rabbi Yossi's opinion. Rabbi Yehuda says Eino Omer Elam Im HaMalchius Bilvad. You can only say with Malchius. Again, the word Trua does not count as Shofar. And finally, the Brisa says, Trua she'eni molo klum. Let's say you have a situation of a pasuk which says the word Trua, nothing else. Kagon Yom Trua Yelochem. For example, the pasuk says it's a day of Trua. So Omrim HaShofaris Divrei Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says you can say that with shofar, same idea. The word Trua counts as shofar. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Eino Omra Kolik. Rabbi Yehuda says you can't use that pasuk at all. It doesn't actually mention shofar. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, quoting the Mishnah, Maschil b'Torah, Mashlim b'Navi. The Mishnah said that when you're reciting the psukim in these brachas, you start with psukim of Torah, you finish with psukim of Navi. Rabbi Yossi says, Im Hishlim b'Torah Yotze. If you finish with psukim of Torah, you're also going to be Yotze. So the Gemara says, Im Hishlim di'evidin l'chatzchila lo. It says, if you finish with psukim of Torah, it sounds like a b'di'evid, l'chatzchila. You shouldn't finish with psukim of Torah, according to Rabbi Yossi, but b'di'evid, it's okay. But the Gemara says, Vatanya, but we learned in a brayso, so we have a contradiction. Rabbi Yossi says, Hamashlim b'Torah hareza meshubach. On the contrary, if you finish with a pasuk of Torah, that's praiseworthy. That sounds like a l'chatzchila. And so the Gemara says, Eima mashlam. Okay, so we could change the text in the Mishnah. It should be finish with a pasuk of Torah, meaning you actually should finish l'chatzchila. But the Gemara says that still doesn't fit. Im hishlim katani. It says if the person finishes. Di'evid in l'chatzchila lo. That sounds like if you do it b'di'evid, it's okay, but it's not a l'chatzchila. And so the Gemara says, Hachi Kamer, here's how you need to read the Mishnah. Maschil b'Torah, mashlim b'Navi. You begin with Torah, you finish with Navi. Rabbi Yossi says, mashlim b'Torah, you should finish with Torah. V'im hishlim b'Navi yotze. The way it should really read is, if you finish with a pasuk of Navi, you're also yotze. Gemara says, Tanya nami hach, we have a brisa that supports this as well. Amer Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Yossi says, Vasikin hayu mashlimin osa b'Torah. Those who were pious, they would finish with a pasuk from the Torah. Gemara says, Bishlama Zichronos v'Shofaros ikatuv. I understand you want to finish Zichronos or Shofros with a pasuk from the Torah. There are plenty of psukim to choose from that mention Zichronos, that mention Shofros. Ela Malchios, but when it comes to Malchios, Tolos Hu Dehavian, there's only 3 psukim in the Torah that mention Malchios. There's Hashem Elokav Yimo Usruas Melech Bo, Vayihi Bishurun Melech, and Hashem Yimloch Li'olam Voed. That's the only ones. Va'anon eser bo'inon v'leka. We're going to need a total of 10. You don't have that. So how are you going to finish with that pasuk of Torah, that 4th pasuk? What is the 4th pasuk that references Malchius? So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Huna says, Tashma, come in here the following. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Malchus divrei Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi holds that the pasuk of Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, that counts even though it doesn't say anything about the word Melech, but it says Hashem is one. Hashem rules over the world. That counts as Malchus according to Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yehuda says, Eina Malchus. That pasuk does not count as Malchus. Another example. The pasuk says, only Hashem is God. So again, Malchus divrei Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says that counts as Malchus. Rabbi Yehuda Eina Malchus. Rabbi Yehuda says that doesn't count as Malchus. Another possible pasuk, Hashem hu Elokim einod milvado. Again, the idea that only Hashem is God and nobody else. Malchus divrei Rabbi Yossi. Again, Rabbi Yossi says that counts as a pasuk of Malchus. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ain't a Malchus. Rabbi Yehuda says that does not count as a pasuk of Malchus. And we should note over here that the question really was only on Rabbi Yossi, because only Rabbi Yossi was the one that says you need to finish with the pasuk from the Torah. You need 4 psukim from the Torah, and we see that Rabbi Yossi has many options of psukim that count as Malchus from the Torah. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah Ha'over Lifnei Ateva B'Yom Tov Shel Rosh Hashana. When the person is leading the davening on the Yontav of Rosh Hashanah, Hasheni Maskia, the second person, meaning during Musaf, that's when you blow shofar. Uveshasa Halal, now in situations where you say Halal, we don't say Halal in Rosh Hashanah, but in situations where we say Halal, Harishon Makres Halal. It's always the first person, meaning at Shacharis, that's when we say Halal. And the Gemara says, Ma'ishna Sheni Maskia. What's the difference that when it comes to blowing shofar, we do it by Musaf? Mishum de Berovam Hadras Melech, because we want to do it when there's a lot of people there. There are more people present at the Musaf davening. So Hihachi Halal Nami name of B'Sheni. If so, Halal also, let's say it by Musaf. Mishum de Berovam Hadras Melech. Again, you have a lot of people there. It's a more glorification of the king if you do it when there's a lot of people. So the Gemara says, Ela Ma'ishna Halal Devarishon Mishum des Reason Makdim Lemitzvahs. So you're going to answer that by Halal we do it by Shachris, because Reason Makdim Lemitzvahs, you want to do the mitzvah as soon as possible. But if that's the logic, Tkiya Nami Nabid Barishon, Tkiya also, you might as well do it by Shachris, Mishum des Reason Makdim Lemitzvahs. We want to do it as early as possible. So whatever reason you give for either doing it by Musaf, you're going to say it's because Barov Hadras Melech, or for doing it by Shachris, because Reason Makdim Lemitzvahs, it should apply to both. And so the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan answers, B'shaz Gezeras HaMalchus Shanu. You're really right, it should be the same. But the Mishnah is talking in a situation where there was a gezerah against the Jews from doing the mitzvahs properly. In other words, there was a gezerah preventing them from blowing shofar. If they would have blown at Shacharis, that's when the authorities were looking for them to be blowing shofar and they would punish them. And so therefore, our Mishnah says to push it off to the Musaf, that's when we blow the shofar. And the Gemara continues at the 2 dots, Midukamer B'shas Halal, from the fact that Mishnah says when we recite Halal, Mechlal Devar Rosh Hashana Leka Halal. The implication of the Mishnah is that we don't say Halal on Rosh Hashana. The Mishnah is just saying, in a situation where you do recite Halal, you should do it by Shachris. So my time, and what's the reason we don't say Halal on Rosh Hashanah? Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Avo says, Amar Malachi Asharis Lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Malachi Ashar said in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ribono Shel Olam, Master of the world, Memnei Mayin Yisrael Omrim Shira Lefanecha B'Rosh Hashanah V'Yom HaKippurim. Why doesn't Klal Yisrael, why don't they say Shira, why don't they say song, Halal, in front of you on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? Amar Lahem, so HaKadosh Baruch Hu says back to them, to the Malachim, Efshar Melech Yoshev Al Kisei Din. Is it possible a king is sitting on the throne of judgment? V'Sifrei Chayim, V'Sifrei Mesim, Pesuchim Lefanav, in the book of life, in the book of death. Those books are open in front of him. V'Yisrael Omrim Shira. You think Klal Yisrael is going to say song, is going to say Halal in that situation. That's why we don't say Halal on Rosh Hashanah and Yom HaKippurim. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Shofar Shel Rosh Hashanah, when it comes to the mitzvah of Shofar on Rosh Hashanah, Ein Ma'avir Nolav Tchum. In order to fulfill the mitzvah, you're not allowed to walk past the Tchum, past the boundary where a person's allowed to walk. You can't violate the halach of Tchum. Vein Mefachin Olav Hagal. You're also not allowed to dig through the rubble in order to get to the Shofar. Lo Olin Be'ilon. You're not allowed to climb a tree. V'lo Rochvan Al Gabe Behema. You can't ride an animal. V'lo Shatan Al Pnei Hamayim. You can't swim in the water. Vein Chotchen Oso. And you're not allowed to cut the Shofar. Bein Bedavar Shum Mishum Shavus. Whether it's something that's Asur Midrabanan to use, or Bein Bedavar Shum Mishum Lo Sasei, or whether it's something that would be an Isser Doraisa Lo Sasei to do. You're not allowed to do any of those things in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Shofar. But if you want to put some water or wine into the shofar that helps to produce a better sound, that a person is allowed to do. We don't stop children from blowing shofar. Let's say they're practicing, they want to blow the shofar, they're not chayiv in the mitzvah, but we allow them to do that. We participate together with them, we let them do it until they learn properly how to do it. Now somebody who's blowing shofar as a mesasik, meaning the person is doing it absent-minded, not even paying attention to what he's doing. Lo yatsa, the person does not fulfill the mitzvah in that situation. Lo yatsa, and also somebody who listens to somebody who's just blowing shofar as a mesasik, again, doing it not for any intention of the mitzvah, not even realizing they're blowing shofar, that person is not going to be yotze. And we'll take a look at Rashi over here. Shofar shel rashayin mefachin olav in ma'avir and olav esat tchum. You can't cross the boundary, the tchum. Leile chutz letchum l'shma tki. In other words, you can't walk past the tchum, past the halachic boundary, in order to hear the tkiyah shofar. Vein chotchen osom mefarish begamar, cutting the shofar. That's all going to be explained in the Gemara. Imratz alitein l'socho mayim. The Mishnah said if you want to put water or wine in the shofar, that's okay. V'lo amrinan kamisakin mana. We don't say that's considered tikkun mana. We don't say that's considered fixing the kli on yontif, and maybe that should be a problem. No, the Mishnah says that's not a problem. And the Gemara says, my timer, what's the reason? Shofar asehu, The reason is that shofar is a mitzvah aseh, v'yontiv aseh v'los aseh, but the violation of yontiv is an aseh and a los aseh. In other words, you might have thought, why can't you do the mitzvah shofar, even in a situation where you're violating yontiv, let the aseh be docha the los aseh. And the Gemara is pointing out, no, to violate yontiv is actually an aseh and a los aseh. It's a positive and a negative commandment. Ve'en aseh doches los aseh v'aseh. The aseh of blowing shofar is not going to push off the los aseh and the aseh of yontiv. And the Gemara continues, lo olin be'ilon v'lo rochvan al gabi behema. You're not allowed to climb a tree, you're not allowed to ride an animal in order to blow shofar. So the Gemara says, hashta d'rabbanan amrit lo. Now the Mishnah already said things which are isurim midrabbanan, meaning going past the tchum or digging through the rubble, that's only nisur d'rabbanan, and the Mishnah said you're not allowed to do that to blow shofar. D'oraisa mi boy, so something like climbing a tree, riding an animal, those can all lead to isur d'oraisa. I need to even mention that? Seems so obvious. And so the Gemara says, you're right, zu vein sarach lomar zu katani. The Mishnah is saying this, and I don't even need to tell you, but this as well is also going to be a problem. And we'll take a look at Rashi over here. Hashta d'rabbanan amrit lo, isur tchumin, upikuach agal, delekala migzar oto do raisa amrit lo. When it comes to the tchum and to digging through the rubble, there's nothing do raisa that could happen. It's all an isur d'rabbanan, and we said that's a problem. So do raisa rochvan, when it comes to riding an animal, let's say, maybe you're going to end up cutting a tree, and climbing a tree. Again, maybe you'll pull branches. Those are things you might do, that's do raisa. So do you even need to say that? Rashi says there are others who have different girsos, but he says that this is the proper girsa and the proper explanation. We'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Lamed Gimel Amud Aleph.